Okay. Okay. Well, welcome back from the break. Politics has already reared its ugly head several times this morning, and in this session we're going to look particularly at walking the tightrope between science and politics. We have three speakers for you, and also responding after they've finished, Philip Schlesinger, who I noticed not only works at Glasgow University, but has an enviable list of places he's worked in the past, including Florence, Madrid, Oslo, Lugano, Toulouse, Paris, Rome, and Salamanca. But first of all, before Philip gets his opinion in at the end, we're going to hear from Timandra Harkness, who's a science presenter and writer, particularly on Radio 4, an RSS fellow, and the author of a book, Big Data, Does Size Matter? So, Timandra, does size matter?
No, obviously it's what you do with it that counts. That's kind of the point of the title of the book, really. Okay, I'm going to see if I can share my screen and show you some slides. Can we have it? Yeah, good, thank you. Okay, so this is so weaponizing statistics. Basically, at the point when I was contacted to see if I would like to speak at this event, I was feeling particularly cross about a particular event, which was the news conference that Boris used to launch English Lockdown 2. And as that week unfolded, and I was in fact writing a piece for Unheard for the same publication that Tom Chivers writes for, various events unfolded in relation to that. So I was clearly not the only one who was enraged by the way graphs, charts and statistics were used in that news conference, really as not at all as a way of informing or enhancing the public understanding of statistics, very much as a way of trying to drive home a particular message, and that in quite a clumsy way. So that's the, if you're interested in when people write things, that's the kind of the origin of this little talk. But it did actually give rise to a much wider topic, which I think is one that we're all interested in, certainly in this session. So you'd like to show me the next slide, please?
Okay.
Yeah, I get to do the next slide, please, Line. So one positive thing, as has already been much cited by other speakers today, is that really quite dry and niche matters of statistics and data have been propelled into the public eye, and who would have thought that they would delay the start of Strictly Come Dancing, so that millions, no, back up, whoa, I haven't said the next slide, easy, Tiger. Someone's got a thumb, a trigger happy thumb. So there has been lots of public interest in seeing charts like this. This is one of the ones I think that was shown at that very news conference. Certainly it has been used. And people are much more data and statistically literate than they were, which obviously starting from probably quite a low bar, but nevertheless, for people like me who think that this should be a matter of public discourse, and yeah, a lot of my work, including writing the book and a lot of the public stuff I do, is all about saying this stuff is important, it's dealing with important issues, and you should at least know enough to be able to ask awkward questions. And I think that's the important skill here. I mean, for myself, I went off kind of well on into another career, went off and studied with maths and statistics with the Open University, so Kevin Bakumwe's old outfit. Mainly, and so I now have a 2-2 in maths and statistics, mainly not so that I can do statistics myself, because my arithmetic is as bad as ever it was, and so I get ludicrous answers, but more to equip me to be able to look at other people's work and ask the question, say, is that really what it says? So I'm very much into trying to get the public to that point as well, to be critical and ask questions, for better and worse. And I have this slight hope. Okay, next slide, please. Good. I have this slight hope that we'll get this similar effect from all these presentations with graphs that we got the silent witness effect back in the 1990s. And I think if you click again, I think there's some more information to come up there on that slide. Excellent. So when Silent Witness started in the 1990s, a TV series about a pathologist, police pathologist, there were 2 forensic science degree courses, and less than 20 years later, there were 285, because there was a massive upsurge in interest amongst teenagers, particularly in studying forensic science, which, you know, and now, of course, there's CSI wherever, and lots of spin-off television series, and it's very glamorous. And there was a lovely article in The Guardian at the time in 2008, I think, from Tim Dowling, who commented that there were now so many science courses that were called forensic science. Many of them were actually just cobbled together from existing science courses, maybe with one specialist one, but we won't mention that. Got lots of kids studying science. So Tim Dowling commented that, like, there were 1,667 students recruited in 2008 alone, which is far more than the number of forensic scientists that could be employed. So he said, well, in order to ensure there are enough jobs to go around, more than half of them will have to retrain as serial killers. That's obviously not what we want. But if you go to the next slide, please, I am slightly hopeful that the effect of what's happening now, and you'd like to click again, that we will actually, the number of statistics degree courses will proliferate equally well. So I had a quick look, and there appear to be 46 degree courses, undergrad courses in Britain, statistics in the title. So my quick and dirty model is, if we do get the same effect as Silent Witness, then the number theatre effect should mean there are 6,555 statistics degrees within the next 20 years. And I think we can all hope for that. But slightly more seriously, I think there is a downside with this, if you like, which is that it's partly the way the numbers are being used and deployed, and being used particularly by politicians. And also another kind of slightly bigger question, I think, which I'll come on to at the end. So if we think about how these numbers and graphs and statistics have been used, I mean, we heard earlier about people saying, well, it seems that every side in an argument can put their hand on some study or some statistic which appears to back up their side of the argument, and then it becomes almost a full-time job unpicking them and saying, well, that's not what that says, it actually says this, so this is a reasonable conclusion from it, this we can't really be certain enough about, and this is just a complete misinterpretation, either through naivety or malice. So you'd like to go on to the next slide, please. So this is the notorious image that was shown at that press conference that was used to justify the second lockdown, and it was rightly pulled apart by many people in the following week. And to be fair, it does clearly say on it, these are scenarios, not predictions or forecasts. It says that at the bottom in capitals. Whether you could actually see this, depending on where you were watching the press conference, was another matter. Certainly it was not made clear during the press conference that these were very headline planning scenarios, some of which had already been updated before the press conference. And if you'd like to go on to the next slide, please. This is one of the newspapers, the Telegraph, picked up on this and pulled it to bits and said, well, actually, the really big curve, the 4,000 deaths a day, which was a figure that was repeatedly cited over that weekend, 4,000 deaths a day, had already been revised before that press conference. And then if I actually went and looked then and said, well, you know, what is at the point where these things are being criticised, what was the relationship between the actual figure of deaths and the ones that were projected or predicted in the graphs, and it was 595 on that particular day, which was pretty high. But then I remembered the previous graph. So next slide, please. So we go back to that. You can see that was a daily, that was a spot figure, and the daily spot figures were going up and down and around a line that was steadily going up. So that was very widely criticised, and in fact it was criticised not only in the media, that particular graph and the press conference in general, but by the Common Science and Technology Committee, who had Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance in for questioning a few days later, and gave them really quite a hard time about the way the science had been presented at that press conference, because it was used to justify quite draconian measures, which I'll come on to in a moment. But the failure of that press conference, and particularly the scientists in that press conference, to use data in a way that justified and explained the justification from the point of view of science, was very strongly criticised. Graham Stringer, who's one of the MPs on the Common Science Technology Committee, picked up that 4,000 graph and figure particularly, and said the vast majority of people in this country are not familiar with modelling. Was it sensible or fair to put forward the graph with 4,000 deaths a day, with or without the caveats? Pictures tell a much more powerful story than numbers. That will have frightened many people around the country. So he goes on, Patrick Vallance replies basically that, it was a scenario, it was a couple of weeks ago, actually probably more than a couple of weeks before, but so he tries to justify it, saying, I did try and say this was just a scenario. And Graham Stringer responded, I don't think people see that. If you look at serious broadsheet press and the more popular tabloids, you see that people have been horrified in the way that was presented. You must realise that if you put a graph up saying 4,000 deaths a day, that is going to be the message that the vast majority of people take home. Do you regret that at all? And Vallance said, the aim of the presentation was to try and get as much information as we could to the public. The 6-week projections were important in terms of their reliability. Those were models for the reasonable worst case scenario, and people have been interested in the reasonable worst case scenario. They were models at the time to try to project that. Stringer came back with, you do not think that you just frighten people who do not have your scientific background and understanding models? And Sir Patrick Vallance said, I hope not. That is certainly not the aim. So I think at this point it's really, and a lot of people did at the time ask questions about, well, what exactly are those graphs and those figures trying to do there? Because they don't explain, they don't give a coherent picture. I mean, one of the other charts shown in the same press conference showed that the R number was trending downwards. It was still above 1, but week on week it was trending downwards. So you could have looked at that and said, well, this is already happening, and therefore do we need to change the measures that are in force at this time, or could we carry on with the existing measures? And other people questioned why out-of-date figures were being shown, as Graham Stringer did there. So I think there's a couple of things I'd like to raise here, really. I mean, we've already heard about number theatre and the way that figures are used dramatically rather than to actually explain anything and make anything clear. And I think there's certainly room for a lot of criticism there. I think one thing we need to be clear on is that the government were offered different strategies for how to influence people's behaviour. And there is one of the SAGE subgroups is about behavioural science. It's about how scientists think people will behave under different circumstances. And I unfortunately couldn't find the table again, but there was a table drawn up on different strategies to try and get people to adhere to the measures that were introduced back in March. And one of them was, you could try to really frighten people about the risk to them, but this could backfire later on. And I think it's pretty clear that did backfire later on, because you got a divide between people who decided that after all, actually, they weren't particularly frightened for themselves because they could see that the risk to them personally was very, very low. And so they didn't see why they should adhere to the measures. And then other people who were very frightened for themselves, in some cases disproportionately so, who then became very angry with the other people. So that actually worked against one of the other strategies that the behavioural scientists proposed, which was to build a sense of community cohesion, social solidarity and responsibility for each other, which, I mean, you can remember we all had very, very strongly in March. There was very much a sense of we're all here for each other. And one of the other strategies that was suggested and was marked as possibly having negative ramifications was the idea of using social disapproval of people who didn't visibly adhere to measures. And again, the behavioural scientists said this could easily backfire, because then you get conflict and division. And I think, again, we can see that nevertheless, that was used and did indeed have those negative effects. So I think in terms of even effectiveness, I think the strategy of trying to frighten people is very questionable. But using particularly statistics and graphs and science to try and do that, to try and frighten people, I think also has other long-term ramifications. We talk a lot about trust, and we talk a lot about the public trusting science and scientists and figures, and I think it's clear that there are things you can do which help with that, like being honest about uncertainty. But we also have to recognise, as somebody did raise in a previous session, that trust in science and in statistics is very much not about an understanding of how statistics work, and telling people facts and showing them graphs almost never changes their mind. It's much more about relationships of trust with people and institutions. And something that is talked about less often is that in order for the public to trust institutions, the institutions also have to trust the public. The institutions have to trust the public to be told truthful pictures, even though those pictures are much more complicated and messy than frightening headline graphs. And that, I think, conspicuously has not been happening. Telling people uncertainty, showing people figures which may appear contradictory and need explanation, or may actually be reassuring in many ways. I mean, at the moment, I think the infection picture is quite reassuring. Infection rates are falling, including amongst the highest risk groups. So there's a lot of good news out there. And I think in the long term, the way to maintain and nurture public trust in statistics, statisticians, data, science, all things which should be really useful tools open to all of us for making decisions, both as individuals and on a social scale, does require that the public is trusted with information, is trusted with quite complex pictures. In fact, could I have the next slide? I am cantering towards a close, honestly. Now, this was actually published in a reputable journal. And now, at first glance, you look at this, and which age groups do you think are at highest risk of hospitalisation, which is the pale blue bar? You would probably say, well, it's the one near the middle, the 65 to 74, and the one over to the left, because that's the next highest. But this is numbers. This is actually a bar chart showing numbers of hospitalisations, admissions and deaths. And the age groups are not of equal sizes. So that bar to the left, 20 to 44, that's 25 years worth of population. So that's a much bigger population than the next one along, which is 45 to 54, which is 10 years. So you glance at this, and it was in a journal article about how many younger people were in ICU and severely ill with COVID in the United States. But I would say this is a very misleading representation of data, because it suggests that 20 to 44-year-olds are in much more danger than they actually are, because you've chosen to take data which might fit better in a histogram and then showed in a bar chart. So I think that it's easy and tempting for people with the best of intentions to be misleading with the way that they portray data, in an effort not to confuse the public or give contradictory messages, or give messages that undermine what is the headline message, which is supposed to be for everybody's good. This is, by the way, not at all unique to COVID. I think this is very common in lots of public policy, and particularly in public health. And I think it throws a question back to those of us who constantly say, well, we would like the public to be more engaged with statistics, data, and be more literate and understand it better, and be more involved in democratic arguments that involve facts and statistics and data. Because one thing that is going to happen as the public becomes more data literate and statistically literate is they will be, I hope, better equipped to question things, and better equipped to get stuck in and say, well, okay, I can see what that graph is telling me, but I don't necessarily agree with your conclusions from it. I think it's entirely legitimate to use data and statistics to try and build an argument and a point of view, including in politics. But I think we do also have to accept that if politicians are going to do that, if public health bodies are going to do that, then the public also must be permitted to do that. And there is going to be contestation of the conclusions that we draw from data, and taking statistics off a pedestal is going to mean that the public gets up close and smells the sweat and sees the warts. So I think we have to brace ourselves for that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Timandra. Just before I introduce the next speaker, could I just ask, if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A box at any time during the talks, and we'll sift through them for later on. Try and keep them separate from comments in the chat box. Okay, thanks. The next up next is Anne Hemingway, who's Professor of Public Health and Wellbeing at Bournemouth University, who's a qualified nurse, and whose research is about inequalities, and we've heard a lot about that during this epidemic. So, Anne, over to you.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm just trying to share my screen. Is everyone seeing that?
Yep.
Okay, great. So, this presentation is not going to be, obviously from the journalist point of view, looking at the series of presentations today. That is predominantly on academics who study that. So this is, you may feel this is slightly different. I hope it's not too off-piste for everyone. And while I was reflecting and preparing for this session, I became very aware that public health expertise and opinion has become somewhat unpopular during the pandemic, since it became, the numbers grew of infections in the UK. And I wanted to address that as well, because I feel that it's very important to look at what is politically unpopular and how that is managed politically as well. And that will be part of what I'm covering. So March 2020, early in the pandemic, we knew very little about COVID-19, and I'm sure people have spoken about this already. We knew very little about the incubation period, the symptoms, how it spread. Could you test positive and have no symptoms? Could you have asymptomatic spread? Which groups were at risk? What treatments might work? What were masks effective, which came along slightly later? And we knew very little. And predominantly what people were experiencing at the beginning was fear. And that was obviously amongst all of us, and that includes the scientists as well, trying to understand what it was that we were dealing with. We were relying on experience with other viruses primarily across science, and the advice to the politicians was based on experience with other viruses primarily, although thinking about expertise as well as opinion and politics, at the time, the SAGE group was very thin on practical public health expertise. I have to say it's grown since then, and the characteristics of it and the membership of it has changed. That's the Strategic Group for Advice on Emergencies in the UK. And importantly, our public health bodies, due to political dominance of decision making and influencing what happens in our public health bodies, Public Health England particularly, has meant that there's been some scapegoating. So we were relying on experience with other viruses, which has proved very useful in terms of vaccine development, because it meant that we could build on that, and the vaccines that have been developed haven't been started from scratch. They were already being worked on before this pandemic, and that knowledge has been utilised. So fear, and many people locked down before the government actually told us to lock down in March, and we were basically in an information vacuum as far as the details of the virus were concerned. There's discussion ongoing in the press and elsewhere about the fact that politics, in politics, the facts alone can't tell us what to do. And there is a tendency within politics and elsewhere to find your conclusion, what you want to do, and then find the facts to underpin it. And again, it was very interesting for me during an interview with the press on the radio in March about the pandemic, and I was asked about what I felt about the lockdown and the impact it might have on the groups that I studied predominantly. And in telling people that I thought that the impact would be substantial, would be more for other groups, as it is elsewhere with other infectious diseases, they tend to settle in areas of low income where people have to work, they can't stay away from work, where they can't self-isolate, where housing is overcrowded, etc. But on saying that therefore people should be self-isolating and they should be shielding, I was told yes, but they don't like it. And at this point I had a bit of an aha moment, which kind of stopped me in my tracks, which isn't easy in the middle of an interview. But as I have the perfect face for radio, I managed somehow to keep going and pull it off. But since then, it struck me all the time we have the figures and then we have people's opinion about the figures. So the statistics which come from people's research, which is detailed, often undertaken over a long period, often peer-reviewed, ideally, which I'm going to talk about a bit more in a minute, is taken as something that everyone should have an opinion on. Now, referring to our last speaker, I have the greatest respect for everyone's opinions, and I also want people to be better informed about science, etc. But sometimes the people that we have giving their opinion are quite spectacularly ill-informed, and that can include politicians. They can be very ill-informed about what's happening with the pandemic, and they can also be very ill-informed about what different professional groups do and how they can contribute and the types of contribution that they make. So the facts alone is right. A drawback with science is that we do use the facts alone. We take biscuit crumbs of knowledge and we add them together, and then we build our research design onto that to try and make sense of what's happening. Whereas politicians have to make decisions in the moment, in the context, with the resources that they have. As scientists, we tend to want the facts to speak for themselves, and that can't be done. It can't happen. But what can happen is that we have less manipulation of the facts, because what's happening, I feel, again, is that we have many conclusions about what's happening, and they're very politically driven. And it's easy to criticize, because who'd want to have the job at the moment of running the country, etc. But it's also very important that people try to pick up politicians on making big assumptions about evidence and who should do what and who has expertise in what, rather than just it becoming the usual dialogue. So it's not just the politicians, though, it is the scientists as well. We're all outside our comfort zone at the moment. And the normal, slow, gradual processes whereby we build confident assertions on what works and what doesn't work in treating viruses, and what we should do and what we shouldn't do around people's behaviour, is normally very incremental and slow. And at the moment, we're dealing with a lot of information being in preprint form where it's not been peer reviewed. We're dealing with scientists sharing a lot of information, and there was some really, really outstanding sharing from China earlier on, which was really helpful in terms of working on the vaccines particularly, and not to be underestimated. So all of us are having to go around the normal quality control methods that we use, and that puts us outside our comfort zone. So now moving on a bit, because I realise time's going by. there is such a thing as unpopular evidence, I found, thinking about or unpopular expertise politically. And I wanted to talk a bit about this in the presentation as well. Now, this comes from the Public Health England website. It's guidance on what local centres and local health protection teams routinely do. And you'll notice that it includes disease surveillance, investigating and managing health protection incidents and outbreaks, delivering and monitoring national action plans for infectious diseases at local level. And you'll also notice that I have an elephant in the bottom corner of the slide. This is one of the two major elephants in the room at the moment, in terms of the political commissioning of a new NHS test, trace, track and isolate system, although everyone, again, common parlance is not to put isolate into that, and actually isolate is the key part of it. And the decision was made, I believe, sometime in March, that we would not utilise the local teams who routinely work with called recordable diseases of different types, where they have to test people, they have to trace and track them, and they have to ask them to limit their behaviour in relation to an infection. And this happens routinely with sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis, tuberculosis, any small outbreaks of infection. This is never mentioned. And I'm a big consumer of the news, and this kind of thing is never mentioned. I'm still pushing money, public money, into this private company, when from the beginning, somewhere, some commissioning, very political commissioning decision was made, which decided to bypass the local. And just recently, in the last couple of months, it's reared its head again to show that the local public health teams are generally getting a 95 to 100% success with testing, tracking, tracing and isolating. Which is very different to the 60% or below 60% that our privatized system is getting. So that's one thing. Another very unpopular politically issue with and very, very well evidenced issue is related to inequalities in health. And this is, again, public health. Local public health experts brought local action to promote and protect health and well-being. And very interestingly, which shows the politicisation of Public Health England, it actually says create a healthcare system which improves health and reduces inequalities. And I've added in health outcomes for different income groups caused by the social determinants of health, because I wanted, for those of you, I'm sure all of you do know, but if you don't know about the social determinants of health and how important they are, then I wanted to just make sure I was being clear to everyone. You'll notice that my elephants on this slide have their heads in the corner, because at the moment, anyone engaging with this type of information politically is being, well, we'll see as we go through. You can see for yourselves. So the social determinants, again, whiz through something that is a major focus of public health expertise. Income, education, housing, unemployment, social care, social support, healthcare, transport, etc. And there's a lot of international work's been done to show that these influences account for between 30 to 55% of health outcomes. And they are outside the control of the health sector. And this is the World Health Organization, bringing together of the evidence. So it's global evidence, but it applies everywhere. The social determinants of health, we're all on a continuum, and they all impact on our health outcomes to a greater or lesser degree. And they're very much impacting on what's happening with COVID at the moment. If you look at our map of tier 3 areas for the UK, it looks like a map of the north-south divide. Where housing is overcrowded, where people have jobs that can't be done from home and they use more public transport, or childcare is provided by family members, that is where the virus will settle, as all viruses do and always have done. But at the moment, again, political poison. So this is a document that came out from Public Health England in August 2020, saying that mortality rates from COVID-19 are more than double in deprived areas and in least deprived areas, etc., etc. And it was very interesting, the title of this. It really struck me. I'm old enough to remember Margaret Thatcher's time in power. And at that time, we were allowed to talk about disparities in health outcomes. We weren't allowed to talk about inequalities or inequities, which are preventable inequalities, which are unfair or unjust. And just after this came out, there became queries about what was going to happen with Public Health England and whether it was going to be morphed into another department, changed, etc. So again, massive amount of evidence, very apparent in the way that the virus is working in our country and elsewhere, not talked about, just ignored. And the expertise to underpin it is very strong in the UK. A lot of the global leading academics in inequalities in health are based in the UK. Again, we're not engaging with it. Political. So I had to put this in. It's slightly American, but enough of your warning bells. This is a post-truth world, and we can go about our business lying and telling untruths or ignoring things as we like. And the problem is that epidemiology, which is primarily what we're dealing with in terms of increased risks for different groups, which is how it works with most of the advice that we're getting, is about warning bells. Epidemiology doesn't do cause and effect, it does increases in risk. And these are much more difficult to share with an audience than, yes, this, we did a randomized controlled trial, and in the group where we gave it, like the vaccine data, it worked this much, in this group, whatever. But epidemiology is about calculating risk across populations, and that is much more difficult to share. And it's something that we're very acutely aware of in the public health discipline. So I really apologize for this slide, but I wanted to show, and this is way outside my comfort zone, I hasten to add, because this is my opinion rather than any research data I'm presenting. So in March, the virus wasn't behaving exactly like other viruses when people were sick. And there was a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, not least in my own profession, where people were having to go in every day and look after, care for people, and they didn't know what this virus would do. They didn't know how they would catch it. They didn't know how they could protect themselves. And I have to add that more nurses have died globally than in World War I now, which you may be aware of, and we're nearly up to 2,000. That's only recorded deaths. So this is real fear and appropriate fear. The opinion at the time was there was fear, as already been mentioned, in the general population, and that health services were being overwhelmed elsewhere. And we saw a lot of images from Italy, for instance. Politics, we had blanket rules, which tended to work. People and the politicians appeared to be following the advice of SAGE. Although I keep saying what happened to track, trace, and isolate, because mainly because, again, it's an elephant, basically. So in July, some groups at more risk, some treatments effective, masks might work, other countries developing reliable systems of isolation, unlike ours. Opinion, fear of job losses, conspiracy theories, masks become political, and some groups at less risk than others, and people became very aware. And that was actually, interestingly, effective as the way that it was shared through the media and from the scientists. We really got that message across that some groups were at less risk than others. We weren't so good at getting the message across about you may not get it at your age, but you can give it to someone at your age. And that was where we weren't so successful. Politics, economy versus virus response. This is an ancient argument. The first International Health Conference in 1851, which resulted in the development of the World Health Organization much later, was about the tension between infectious disease and trade. But again, the elephant in the room. So in November, vaccines may be effective, rates climbing, tracking health inequalities, can very much see that now. And confusion is a general opinion. There's lots of conspiracy theories, there's the anti-vaccination movement, there's a lot of job losses, and there's a realization that our NHS track and trace system isn't working unless it's done by local public health teams, as I already mentioned. And in politics, we have factionalism politically, we have confused advice. The SAGE group maybe starting to withdraw itself, separate itself from the politicians, and it gave different advice to the government on lockdowns to what the government actually finished up doing. So my analysis is, as the scientific knowledge grows, advice becomes more nuanced and there's more scope for disagreement, confusion, and misinformation. So nearly finished, you'll be glad to hear, no doubt. So getting asked what your opinion is difficult when you're a scientist, because you want, as I said, we're flawed beings, humans, but we want the science to talk for itself. So obviously it can't. And I was just quoting myself out of an earlier interview. Well, the evidence suggests we need another lockdown, otherwise the hospitals and health services will be overrun. And the response I had was, due to the impacts of lockdown, we don't want one. And our opinions matter as we get to vote on whether we have a lockdown. And of course they do. Ultimately, it's the politicians, which may make us think more deeply in terms of who we vote for, maybe next time around. I just wanted to finish up with whose opinion matters anyway. I really like this. You've probably all seen it before, but it's again, it's really important. And I do think that in some media settings, it does appear that what you want to see is an argument, and I'm not sure that the facts do really matter so much. And just to finish, wanted to do something a bit more positive, but my elephants are still there from test, track, trace, and isolate, and inequalities in health. But we do have some hope for the future. And I'm not making light of the tragedy that is the pandemic for so many people all around the world. And also just to highlight that it will be nurses who will deliver and organise to deliver the majority of the vaccines given globally, and that includes in the UK. So it would be great to hear in the media a bit about the nurses' role, because there's some maybe some sexism, dare I say, in there, because we are a feminised profession, and also we're a racialised profession. We have much higher rates of different Black and minority ethnic groups who work in nursing as well. But basically we have hope now, so that's a good thing. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Have we lost Lawrence?
Are you there, Lawrence?
I've sent Lawrence to sleep.
Shall I just start, Anne?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
I think he's lost.
We've lost his connection. I'll try sharing my screen.
Yep.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
And can you see my slides in full screen?
Yep. Not yet.
That full
Yep,
screen
no.
now? Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Okay, fine. Thanks very much, Anne and colleagues, and thanks to Lawrence as well. So sorry that some of what I'm going to mention has been addressed in some of the previous sessions already today, but hopefully not too much repetition. So I was going to give a sort of standard SMC talk at this event, where I show examples of what we call rapid reaction comments and press briefings we've run that have helped inform the media coverage of certain developments in the COVID-19 story. But given the really interesting mix of people that are both speaking at and attending this event, I decided it might be more interesting for me to raise a few issues that we've been discussing among ourselves at the SMC that are relevant to the title of this session. Not because I have any or all of the answers, but I think they're things that are worth thinking about, and hopefully others might have ideas. But I will say a bit about what the SMC has been busy with over the past 11 months, because it is also relevant to this session. So from day one of the UK news media's interest in what was back in January a mysterious flu-like illness in Wuhan, and temporarily a little later on, snake flu, we've been extremely lucky in two respects. One, that scientists have stepped up to the plate and been willing to engage and answer journalists' questions and respond to every twist and turn in the pandemic. And we heard this morning from Pamela Duncan, Tom Chivers, and Jane Kirby, who all mentioned how crucial this relationship is for them with the scientist. And two, that the UK's science and health journalists have been asking for the input of the best scientists in the UK, have been keen to reflect the views of experts, and have been careful to ensure evidence doesn't get lost among the wealth of opinion out there. So thanks to both these things, the media coverage of the science of COVID has by and large been very good. We're lucky in the UK to have kept our specialist science journalists. After the MMR and autism health scare in the 90s, I think it was recognised in newsrooms that no matter how big a science story becomes, it should not be taken away from the science journalists who understand most where the weight of evidence lies. And Pamela mentioned this morning how in demand she and her fellow data journalists have been in their newsrooms throughout COVID. But of course, COVID isn't just about science anymore, or it isn't just about data. And it is right that the politics, economics, social impacts, and everything else are covered by those journalists, and that difficult questions are asked. But it will always be a science story. This next slide, I'm not showing you this slide just to say that we've had a busy year. It's actually to illustrate the massive thirst among journalists for science and for scientists, and also to illustrate the responsiveness of scientists and statisticians to that need. So at the SMC, we've run about 100 press conferences on COVID since January, and we've kept these the preserve of the science and health journalists. Our average attendance is something like 30 science journalists, so they do all come, from the BBC to the Guardian, the Sun, the Telegraph, the Times, the Mirror, the Mail, PA, and Reuters. These journalists want to hear from scientists and hear about evidence. They ask sciencey questions about the data. They ask about numbers and confidence intervals and about uncertainties. It's great to see. They also ask tough questions about policy and implications, about whether schools should close and whether we should stay in lockdown, and whether kids should hug their grannies at Christmas. Just to mention one specific kind of series of briefings we did during the first wave, we ran 10 weekly briefings on the death stats with David Spiegelhalter and two other experts who gave their kind of live digest of what the stats were saying and what they thought the implications were. We've also sent out somewhere around 1,000 roundups and rapid reactions. So these are written quotes from scientists in response to developments in the story or critiquing new scientific papers, preprints, or reports. The science journalists often ask us for these, and they also often use them, quoting sections of their comments in their articles or interviewing the scientists for TV or radio. And all this helps inform the media coverage, helping make sure that the public hear from qualified experts on the things they care about, and prevents leaving a void. So we'll keep doing all these things, but how do we make sure that journalists continue to have access to the best science when things are increasingly politicized? And how can we make sure the best scientists keep engaging and don't pull back from the fray? And David Spiegelhalter raised the question this morning of how you can continue to engage while avoiding being politicized. In the first couple of months of COVID, the story was almost exclusively covered by science journalists. The SMC's chief exec, Fiona Fox, wrote a blog in February, which was before the one Kevin McConway mentioned this morning, which was praising the science journalists for their coverage and defending their right to write worrying stories that some people assumed at the time was just an alarmist media feeding frenzy. Scientists were, after all, alarmed. But at some point during the first wave, it started being covered by political journalists. I remember naively being confused about this at the time. Just because Boris Johnson was involved didn't make it a political story, I thought. Of course, it is now a political story, among other things, but I'm not sure whether political journalism alone best serves the public trying to get to grips with what COVID means for them. I also think there's a danger that gotcha type questioning has led some top quality scientists to turn down media interviews, feeling that room wasn't being made for the nuance in what they had to say, and worrying about being oversimplistically pitched against someone or something when that wasn't always the case. For a while, my colleagues and I thought it might just be us who groaned at some of the lines of questioning taken by political reporters at the Downing Street pressers. It turns out some scientists felt the same too. And this isn't an objection to asking difficult questions, not at all. Those questions undoubtedly ought and need to be asked. Instead, it's that sometimes when most people want more light, sometimes all we got was heat. When the evidence changes or the evidence base develops, as it has done on various things, including face masks, outdoor transmission, and asymptomatic transmission, the response to COVID also has to change. Instead of leaping on a U-turn, I think many people would rather we could actually hear about and understand the evidence and the science and the reason why policy may or may not reflect that. Naturally, it's been great to have seen recently more appearances from science journalists like Fergus Walsh, Tom Clark, Chris Smythe, Sarah Bosley, Martin Baggett, and Laura Donnelly at those number 10 pressers. They ask difficult questions, of course, but there's always room for evidence, uncertainty, and nuance. So I do think there is cause for celebration of much of the media coverage of COVID. But journalists aren't there to educate the public or to communicate science. Their job is to tell stories. That will mean that the articles they write won't always be the ones of greatest scientific significance. It might just be something that's new or controversial. And we've heard today about preprints being increasingly part of what gets written about on COVID and the challenges that they bring. Sometimes scientists find this painful or irritating, but we say to them that the alternative to them helping is that the story will just happen anyway without any experts in it. And we know that the public still gets most of their information about science from the traditional mass media, whether that's seeing the TV evening news or clicking a link on Twitter that takes them to a Mail Online article. So scientists need to keep responding and keep answering journalists' questions about the science until they are blue in the face if needs be. We know these comments can make a difference and lead to more proportionate coverage. So we'll keep persuading scientists to get involved even when the stakes are high, in fact, especially then. Science in the headlines is an opportunity as well as a threat, and no doubt the public have never been as interested in epidemiology, modelling, virology, public health and statistics, as Tamara mentioned, as they are now. And we'll keep answering the calls of the science journalists and helping them find good experts when they need them. But journalists aren't the only players in the COVID media storm. What about scientists? The SMC's main resource is our database, brilliant and top quality scientists from institutions across the UK who are willing to drop what they're doing when they can to answer journalist questions or give us a written quote on a breaking story. Of course, as an SMC press officer, I am biased when I say that I love and admire the scientists and statisticians who've got stuck in during COVID, but it's true. The media coverage over the last 11 months would have looked very different if it wasn't for those scientists giving up their time to help journalists and the public understand the evidence and put it into context. And I can't wait until we're allowed to have parties again, as we'll certainly be throwing a large one for all the scientists who've been invaluable this year. But scientists are also human. They have opinions as well as expertise. They can be political, and some have also felt desperately frustrated at times during COVID, which of course is understandable. But what I love most is those scientists who, despite all those things, take an objective and evidence-based view of what they are being asked about. Scientists who see their job not as adding their opinion to all those other opinions out there. We all have opinions on COVID, after all, as it's affected us all to varying degrees, but as injecting evidence and commenting on the data and helping the public navigate what we know and what we don't know. Yes, we should all have a say on how the country responds to COVID, but scientists have something extra, and that is the ability to critically analyse what is going on scientifically. That doesn't mean their view counts for more than anyone else's, but it does mean that they can bring something different. And Timandra also mentioned trust, and this slide is the latest Veracity Index, which shows that scientists are still one of the most trusted groups in society. So 82% of people surveyed said they trusted scientists to tell the truth. But I think that trust has to be earned, and it can't be taken for granted. I don't know the reasons for the high level of trust in scientists, but I would put money on it being something to do with them sounding sciencey. That means sticking to the evidence, talking about data, changing their minds when the evidence changes, and being open about uncertainty, being honest about what we don't know as well as what we do know. And Tom Chivers this morning mentioned the importance of scientists emphasizing what we don't know and what we're not saying. And also that they don't take sides from an ideological perspective, but they're open to the views of other scientists, while of course criticizing them if the evidence doesn't stand up. There is in some case genuine scientific disagreement on some aspects of COVID. Given how new it is and how much we still don't know, it would be weird if there wasn't. But COVID in the media hasn't been another MMR. We have heard different views among scientists, yes, but those differences have often been real. and we haven't seen the media give undue weight to mavericks. So I think the media are dealing well with scientific differences, with differences within the scientific community, but are the scientists? By and large, yes, I think. Again, there's a lot to celebrate, but there have been some instances of scientists becoming advocates for a certain position. I think we have enough advocates out there that we don't need scientists to be too. Science needs to occupy a special place, which is not ideological, but evidence-based. And that, of course, means changing your view when the evidence changes, not being a campaigner for a certain position. I think there's also a danger in scientists putting people they disagree with in camps. Yes, there are disagreements, but these should be based on evidence, not ideology. So there should be no need to label different teams. I think we should keep talking critically about evidence and keep openly debating issues rather than trying to shut down people with different views. The other thing which makes scientists and statisticians sound sciencey is staying in their lane, commenting when the subject at hand is within their expertise, but leaving it to others when it isn't. Scientists shouldn't be know-it-alls, not just because science doesn't yet know everything about COVID, but because one individual scientist, often with expertise in quite a narrow field, certainly can't. Behavioural scientists, modelers, virologists, public health experts also all have quite specific areas of research, and I think it's a sign of expertise, not of ignorance, to say, I don't know. And even when something is within a scientist's expertise, they shouldn't shy away from unknowns and shouldn't feel the need to present something as more clear-cut than the evidence backs up. Being open about uncertainties also means that I think messaging and strategy is best left to comms and policy experts. It isn't the job of scientists or statisticians. Scientists aren't government, and I think they should resist being sucked into messaging campaigns. Data are data, the evidence is the evidence, regardless of whether it is convenient to public messaging or policy or not. On all aspects of COVID, vaccine safety, modelling of the next wave, the effectiveness of social distancing measures and of lockdown, talk about the data and the evidence rather than reflecting the greater good. So in this remarkable year where there's been only one story in town, should scientists get political and become advocates? Well, of course they can if they want to. But rather than this adding something to the debate, I worry it risks taking something away. And that's that scientists are the ones among us who can critique and expertly assess what is going on. It just so happens because of this virus that 2020 is the year of the scientist. We need them to keep being sciencey. And just as the public seem to trust scientists, I think we can afford to trust the public too. I think sometimes we don't give people enough credit. I think the people can understand uncertainty and can cope with nuance, especially in a situation like a brand new virus. So to scientists and statisticians, please keep doing the very best science. Please keep telling journalists about it, warts and all. Please keep responding to journalist requests when they are relevant to your expertise, but not when they're not. Please keep being honest and open about uncertainties. And please don't take sides or become campaigners at the expense of assessing every new piece of evidence on its own merits. And that's it from me.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left. First of all, let's hear from Phil Schlesinger, who's going to respond, and then we'll take some questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A box.
I'm trying to stop sharing my screen. Have you still got my screen up?
Yes, we have.
I can't see a stop sharing button.
I'm not sure it really matters. Thanks, Lawrence. Thank you for asking me to respond. I'm struck that actually areas of expertise that my colleagues and I have, political science, sociology, culture and communications, really haven't played into the debate greatly, which is quite interesting. I think I'd like to just make some general points first about what's come out of the three presentations, and then, if time permits, try to engage with each of them. First, I think the wider context is that there is a kind of crisis of the public sphere in a divided society, and that the way the debate has played out is very much in that context. And it has been mentioned, perhaps not quite enough, that the fault lines of British society are on display geographically, socially, economically, and all the rest of it. And I think that's one way of understanding how the debate is played out. Secondly, I think there's really a very major tension between, if you like, conceptions of rational behavior and reason, which I think have been exemplified in many of the contributions today, where calculation as close to being exact as possible and so on are seen as the virtues, recognizing that there are risks and uncertainties. And secondly, and I think this has been touched on just now, the whole question of emotion and fear and denial that is very much part and parcel of how messages land and how people interpret them. And then I think there's another big tension, which I think has been touched on in the three presentations, which is that between the expert and the lay, if you like, which is very much part of the analysis of the sociology of science and how that might be resolved. And I'm not sure it is resolvable, but what we have is different types of knowledge in circulation, and they're always going to be contested. So I don't think easy resolutions or rational models are going to capture the situation that we face, however desirable they may be. And then I think there's another big dimension of the politics, which again has been touched on, but perhaps we should put right in the center, which is that choices and strategies are being played all the way through this crisis, and they have to do with the relationship between the public and the private, and they have to do with actually honesty in the allocation of resources. And finally, and I think this again has played into the discussion, the question of social inequality, which is not only about health inequality, but actually very fundamentally about communications inequalities. If you think about the impact, for example, on schooling of the crisis and the differential access to digital technologies, you can see that that too is very important. And two broad characteristics for which there is some evidence from research that's been conducted over the last year is that there has been progressive news flight, if you like, that fewer people are tuning in, not absolutely, but there is definitely a tendency. And secondly, that skepticism and mistrust of mainstream media has risen as well. So those would be my sort of generalizing comments. And then I'd just like to touch, if I may, on each of the contributions. Firstly, Timandra's, which is based on the assumption that a knowledgeable public is desirable. And I wholeheartedly agree with that, I have to say. And what she was focusing on was data literacy. And I think we need to add to that something called media literacy. In other words, to understand the communications environment in which we're living. And this has been made much more dramatic by the pandemic, but it's been made much more dramatic, I think, by what Stuart was referring to in the last session, which is actually the rise of fake news and, if you like, the populist culture that is definitely shaping the environment in which we're living. So political divisions are at the heart, inescapably so, of how the debate is being conducted. Living in Scotland as I do, I cannot in any way ignore the fact that how messages, government policies delivered by the First Minister there, Nicola Sturgeon, contrasts very favourably to how Boris Johnson delivers his messages. And I'm not making a political point, I'm just referring to what public opinion surveys show. So there is an issue there about the credibility of leaders, which is part and parcel of how the whole issue is being played out. And what we've also seen, if you want to think about some of the challenges to the implications of scientific arguments and the way these are processed as political decisions, the economics has come back big time, for example, through the reassertion of the politics of the north of England, as well as the different policy processes that are going on in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And I
Philip,
think
I'm sorry to interrupt, Philip.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
sorry to interrupt, but we have only 2 minutes left in the session.
Yeah, I guess
I'd really like to get onto a couple of questions.
Absolutely.
So if you could draw your remarks to a close, I'd be very grateful.
We could go a little bit over, don't worry.
Remarks to the close instantly, Chair. Thank you. But I'd be very happy to communicate with Anne and Fiona, because I really found your presentations extremely interesting, and I haven't got round to speaking about those at all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Philip, and do pass those remarks on. I'm sure they'll be as interesting as that one was. Questions in the inbox, in the Q&A box, if you can. One interesting question from Milan Joshi: should data literacy be part of general education? I think this was prompted by the bar chart that Timandra showed, where the age divisions were not equal. Should that happen? Should there be a course in O-level in data literacy? What do people think? Timandra, you raised the issue. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I did. I mean, I also put a type to reply in the box, because I could see we were running short of time. Yes, I think is the short answer. Yes, we should. And one of the things I think that it would be helpful if happened, certainly at school, but in other walks of life, is to just generally get some rules of thumb. But I think it's part of a slightly bigger problem, which is that we tend to be overawed by numbers and statistics. That it actually wouldn't take any maths to look at that and say, well, hang on, the age range here is 25 years and the age range here is 10 years. So obviously, and this is numbers, it's not a percentage. So obviously that's going to be more people. So you'd expect more of them to be in hospital. But we feel overawed. So we don't ask simple basic questions anybody could ask. But also, I do think it's a responsibility of people who are deciding how to display information to go, this could be misleading. This could easily be misleading, and we shouldn't display it this way. We should display it a different way where the true meaning of the data is more clear.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I wonder if I could knock on that question a little and ask Fiona, Fiona Lethbridge, do you think, Fiona, there should be some kind of literacy qualification for journalists, data literacy qualification?
I would be reluctant to say yes to that, simply because you could apply that to any kind of journalist. Sometimes you hear scientists saying, oh, it's appalling that these science journalists don't have science degrees, but you don't say the same of political journalists don't have to have been MPs. Sports journalists don't have to have been sports people, etc. So I don't think it's the job of the journalist to be an expert in what they're covering, but it just highlights the fact that they need to have easy and quick access to people who are experts and who can talk them through whatever it is they're talking about. Of course, it's helpful for people to have a certain degree of understanding of things, including data and stats, but I wouldn't personally jump on a sort of need for a formal qualification.
Okay, no formal qualifications then, I can breathe again. A question that's been raised about more recent events, really, and that is, what about the data on vaccines? We're seeing most of the data we're being shown is from press releases, and we're being continually told, don't worry, the MHRA will look after this. But there isn't any published data, is there, Fiona? Is that something that makes you nervous?
Well, there is published data from some of the groups. So Oxford have published up until their phase 2 in the Lancet, and I think both Oxford, AstraZeneca and Pfizer have said that they are in the process of publishing their phase 3 data. But yeah, you know, it's difficult when things have to, when things do or have to come out by press release. And I certainly don't understand the sort of stock market reasons for these things, but I think there's a reason that things have to be announced in that way before all the data is available. But yeah, it certainly does leave room for questions, and of course questions are fine. And so what we need is for the scientists to be able to answer those questions in detail and keep answering them when they come up. But hopefully we will soon have more data on all of the vaccines, and people will be able to pore over it and look at the stats and look at the numbers, and we will learn more.
Okay, could I ask Anne as well? You've talked about two big elephants in the room about the lack of involvement in local public health, do you think a third elephant in the room might be the fact that people will reject vaccines?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the chart that Fiona kindly showed, which has nurses at the top, as it fairly consistently does in terms of trusted groups by the public. Obviously, nurses have a massive role in terms of sharing reliable information on vaccines with people locally and where they work, and with each other and other healthcare professionals around enabling the uptake of vaccines. I think some habits, hopefully some really good lessons will have come out of COVID and the rapid development of vaccines and the rapid sharing of safety data, and also data of effectiveness in different age groups and genders, etc. Because, you know, everyone knows, it's public knowledge that pharmacology companies, big pharma, very often get fined for not sharing complete data, well, almost every year. So I'm hoping personally and professionally that lessons will be learned for those companies around how rapid sharing of reliable, complete data to enable reanalysis, which is now being pushed on, not pushed on in my case, because I welcome it, but is now being expected when scientists get big research funding grants, is that you will make your data available for others to analyze. And I would hope that those moves and the tragedy that is COVID will help to change the mindset moving forward, because I think the more transparency we can have, the more people can see the original data, have access to the original data, the better and more reliable our discussions will be with people around having a vaccine. And it was unfortunate that herd immunity fell into the parlance so early in the COVID-19 pandemic. We have never, ever reached herd immunity without a vaccine, ever, for any infectious disease. And again, those queries have not been dealt with very well, I don't think, either by scientists or elsewhere, to say that the vaccine is what gives us herd immunity, and the uptake of the vaccine is what helps us to achieve it. And when we achieve it, that means that people are free again. So again, it's trying to, I think, build the dialogues. It's not just understanding the stats, it's building the dialogue in a way which enables people to understand where we're starting from and what we need to do to get to that end point. So yeah, I think COVID, terrible as it is, may have helped us to get to a data sharing global attitude. And I think scientists are very good at sharing internationally, private companies less so.
Okay, thank you very much, and I think we must draw the session to a close because we're already overrunning and impinging on the next session's time limit. So I think we should thank our three speakers with the usual applause buttons, and my personal thanks for being so interesting. On to the next session.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.